Amateur Traveler is in its 20th year now, but can you imagine if I had people on the show who had never been to the destination, but had just read about it or seen a movie about it? That wouldn't make any sense at all, and you wouldn't listen. We all know how important it is to receive advice from people who know a destination to get the most authentic local experience. And a great option for experiencing this is Explore Worldwide and their authentic small group adventures, led by local tour leaders, perfect for solo travelers who want to meet like minded people with a desire for adventure. I'm often an independent traveler, but two of my last three trips were with small group tours because they organize everything and it's a lot easier. If you want to recreate the tour I did to Malta, they have a Malta and Gozo Discovery Tour. I'm intrigued by one of their tours called A Taste of Sicily. The company again is Explore Worldwide, and visit exploreworldwide.com to learn more. And thanks to Explore Worldwide for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler. The nights are long, the days are short, and the weather is chilly to downright cold, depending on where you are. It's a good time to slip into a Quince iconic Mongolian cashmere sweaters, which start at only $50. You can treat yourself to everyday luxury at an affordable price with Quince. If you really want to dive into luxury, you can check out their leather handbags, washable silk shirts, and European linen sheet sets. Whatever you're looking for at Quince, all the prices are 50 to 80% less than similar brands, and they do that by partnering directly with top factories and cutting out the middleman. They only work with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing processes. And of course, they use premium fabrics and finishes for that luxury feel in every piece. But you've already heard me rave about my Quince travel pants. Treat yourself this winter without the luxury price tag. Go to quince.com/traveler for 365-day returns plus free shipping on your order. That's QUINCE.com/traveler to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/traveler. And thanks to Quince for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler.
I got my bags packed, I'm on a roll. I'm heading out there and I'm ready to go. I'm looking real good in my passport photo. Oh, no.
Amateur Traveler, episode 170. Today, the Amateur Traveler goes to Cuba. Hear about the food, the people, the music, and the scenery of this island nation.
Sit in one more cafe. I know that I should be heading home, but maybe not today.
Welcome to the Amateur Traveler. I'm your host, Chris Christensen. Before we get into today's interview, I do have a few news stories for you. The biggest news story is clearly the landing / crash / ditching of Flight 1549, the U.S. Airways flight that landed in the Hudson River. Unless you've been under a rock, you've probably already heard about that, and I don't know that there's a whole lot more to say other than, wow. In the second news story, in this week's episode, you'll hear me make a prediction, which is that the Obama administration will open up travel to Cuba. And since we've recorded this interview, but before it came out, there was an announcement from Hillary Clinton, the nominee for Secretary of State, that indeed they do plan to at least open up travel for families of people in Cuba to relax those probably more back to the 2003 regulations. If you're planning on traveling to Taiwan, speaking of changes, Taiwan has just banned smoking in hotels, restaurants, and airports, which is quite a big change for that very smoky country. So yet another country has moved towards smoke-free. And if you're looking for more information on any of those three stories, as well as another story about an airline that's going to charge you by the minute, check out the show notes at amateurtraveler.com. I'd like to welcome Sam to the show from New York City. Sam has been on the show before and has come to talk to us about Cuba. Sam, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. It's good to be on. Thank you for having me again.
Now, it's not just that I'm trying to make the show more controversial by talking about going into Israel the day that the Israelis roll tanks into Gaza Strip and talking about going to Cuba with someone who is an American, but this is a controversial show because, and Sam, why don't you explain what's the deal with Cuba and being an American. If you're a European, Cuba is an open destination.
Correct. The Americans, as most people listening know, have an embargo against Cuba. And different presidencies have had different rules and regulations for whether or not citizens can go to Cuba and under which circumstances they can. According to what internet research I've done, and please do your own because I'm not a legal expert, it was easier to go under the Clinton administration than it is now. And if you go now, you have to cover your bases or hide, sneak, go in from a different country. In other words, you can go legally from Miami as an American citizen if you go to the website, find out what permission you need, and go legitimately with permission from the U.S. government.
And when we say with permission, generally the permission is for press or for humanitarian relief efforts.
And if you have family.
And if you have family, correct. That's right, the third one.
And there's one other one, which is professional organizations. So if, for example, there was a medical conference and you're a doctor.
Okay.
So, yeah.
And Sam, which of those did you use?
After researching how difficult it was to go legally, I took a vacation to the Bahamas and ended up in Cuba.
Well, imagine your surprise.
Indeed.
And we're going to skip over that a little bit. And as I said, this is going to be a little more controversial. There's at least one longtime listener who's probably a little mad at me right now that we're talking about going to Cuba because he's married into a Cuban family. Why did you go to Cuba?
I went to Cuba because I'm a quarter Cuban.
Okay.
And I've always wanted to go, regardless of that. I mean, obviously that's a part of it. And also, I've heard great things about it. I know a lot of Americans who've been. Many of them went when they were studying abroad somewhere else. Okay. If you're in a different country for a year, it's very easy to take a vacation to Cuba. It doesn't really matter what your citizenship is at that point. The only difficulty is if you're an American living in America with only an American passport and you want to go.
And what was your itinerary in Cuba?
I did a short trip. I only went to Havana and Trinidad, and then went back to Havana, and that was it.
Okay. And total time on ground?
I was supposed to be there for 9 days, but I only had 8 because of a flight problem.
Getting into the country then?
Right, but it ended up being a mixed blessing because I met other people on the same flight who were bumped for the same reason, and we became really close friends. So when I was inside of the country, I had local friends, which was an awesome, awesome experience.
So you met people who were from Cuba as you were being bumped?
They live in America.
Okay.
One of them was an American married to a Cuban.
Okay.
One of them was a Cuban who immigrated legally to America.
And what was the highlight of the trip for you?
The highlight of the trip was actually being with local people. As almost every guest has told you about almost every country, the people in Cuba are very welcoming. They let you into their homes and they share their food and their love and their music with you, and they're extremely, extremely kind. So that was the highlight of the trip. I was there for New Year's and I spent it with locals, and that was incredible.
And is a Cuba New Year the same as what we're used to in terms of celebration? What's uniquely Cuban about it?
It was very communist.
Okay.
And by that, I mean, well, it was also very family-oriented. There weren't so many parties, like, on the street. A lot of Latin American countries, I think, have a very family-oriented culture. Mm-hmm. And in Cuba, it seemed like everybody was spending New Year's with their family group. So luckily, my brother and I, who I was, by the way, traveling with my brother, we were invited into a home from some of the people that we'd met on the flight. And that was amazing. We celebrated New Year's by dancing to local Cuban music, as well as Michael Jackson. And then at the stroke of midnight, we turned on the TV to watch some, I guess you would call it propaganda clips with Fidel Castro and Che Guevara and newsreel footage, and then some cannons broadcasting shots across the bay and shouts of Viva Cuba and 50 years of the revolution.
Oh, because this was the 50 years, right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this year is now the 50th year since Cuba was communist.
Since the fall of Batista.
Right, the fall of the Batista regime.
And you are quarter Cuban. Do you speak Spanish?
Sí.
Okay. So
but
were you
not fluently.
Were you communicating mostly in Spanish or mostly in English?
I'd say 50-50.
Okay. Biggest surprise?
Everything is contradictory. So the biggest surprise was that you'd be walking down a street and you've heard that Cuba is full of colonial architecture that has all of the paint peeling and is falling apart. And on one side of the street, you would see that.
Mm-hmm.
And then on the other side, you would see a building that's been completely renovated. The facade has been fixed up, it's been repainted, and it looks gorgeous like any other colonial city facade in the world.
Okay.
And in the same way, you'd see just examples of both sides of the culture and both sides of communism and then other examples of capitalism. It's a very dualistic country. They've set up a dual economy, and there's almost a separation between locals and tourists.
Now, do you still have in Havana the 50-year-old cars and that culture?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, all of the photographs that you see of Cuba, you'll have some wonderful ones in the slideshow of the show, of course, but also if you just Google it on any website. I mean, the classic cars are one of the flavors of Havana. That's part of how you know you're in Cuba when. So it's fantastic. I mean, the classic cars are driving all over the place. Some of them are in a state of disrepair, belching smoke, but other ones are gorgeous. Absolutely fantastic.
Were you using a guidebook to get around, or what did you have for trip
Yes.
planning?
I had heard that the Blue Moon guidebooks was the best one to take to Cuba.
Okay.
If your listeners want a recommendation, I can't really wholeheartedly recommend it. My brother and I both agreed that the maps were weak, and that's my favorite thing about guidebooks is being able to walk around the city and use the map so I don't have to actually do much more of the reading. And having used Lonely Planet my whole life, I was a little upset that this guidebook didn't have numbers in the maps, so you couldn't easily reference where you were and what you were going to. So I ended up having to make my own notes in pen on all of the maps so that I could walk the city without having to flip back and forth and try to find where everything was.
And what did they recommend? What do you see when you're in Havana nowadays?
Well, Havana is a gigantic city, but it's also a walking city, and it's got a lot of different neighborhoods. So it's got things to do in the nightlife, restaurants to eat at. Cuba is well known for its music scene. And then in addition to that, there's the architecture and museums in Vieja Havana, which is the old part of the city, cathedral squares. So it's a lot like going to other countries where you would want to see the old part of the city, the squares, the plazas, and old churches. But it's got a very different flavor. Again, it's the dualism of Cuba. It is a Caribbean Spanish-speaking country.
Sure.
So it is a little bit similar to, for example, Puerto Rico or Dominican Republic. But it's also quite different. It's the largest one. The culture there is the most colonial, the most Spanish, but at the same time, it's very mixed with the Afro-Cubans, who were traditionally in the old times slaves, but have been incorporated into the culture with freedom for over 100 years. So
let's get a little more specific. You talked about restaurants and nightlife and squares and such. Which particular restaurants, what particular square should one go to? Where is the best nightlife spot?
Let's see. I did not bring my guidebook back with me because I didn't want evidence. So I don't have anything to reference for the names. But for nightlife, I chose not to go out very often because the impression I got from other people was that locals didn't go to the nightlife bars and nightclubs unless they were women for sale. So being the type of traveler who wants to enjoy what locals do and see the country not just as a foreigner, just only from the tourist side, I went out a little earlier, like around 7 or 8, and had a couple drinks at places where local bands were playing live music and walked down the streets in Old Havana. And so if you're there, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about, and you just follow the foot traffic and enjoy the bars and the music, because that was what I found to be most rewarding.
Okay, so you weren't necessarily going to the spots recommended by the guidebook anyway, the tourist spots. And when we say tourists, predominantly European and Caribbean tourists.
European, Caribbean. I met a lot of South American tourists and a lot of French, yeah.
Restaurants.
That is the joke in the beginning of the guidebook that I liked best. It says, what are the 3 biggest losses to the revolution? And the answer is breakfast, lunch, and dinner. So I can't really recommend the food, and most people will tell you the same thing. If you want really good Cuban food, go to Miami or Tampa. I ate at a lot of restaurants, and some of them were delicious on occasion, but it was hit or miss. They change frequently, and it depends upon access to resources. I was at one restaurant where the special was octopus. The staff told me it was really good, and by restaurant, I mean someone's house with a government license to serve food with 3 tables set up in their patio.
Okay.
And my brother said he would get it also, and the waitress said, "Oh, that sounds wonderful." Walked back into the kitchen, and a minute later came back and said that they didn't have any octopus, which she had just told us was the special. And considering that they only had
3 tables,
she should have known that.
Okay.
So basically, you're not going to go to Cuba for the food. It's going to be really difficult to get wonderful food. And if you try hard and pay a lot of money, you're not going to get value for your money because it's not a market system. So the restaurants have to pay an arm and a leg for imported things from other countries because they're not produced locally, and they're only using them for tourists in that restaurant. And there's not a high demand for high-quality food.
Okay. And we've seen in the Eastern Bloc, as they've come out from under communism, that there isn't a service ethic necessarily ready to accept tourism immediately, that took a while to develop. Is that similar than in Cuba?
I don't know if that's the same, because I think that the government realized 50 years ago when they took over the country that one of their hopes for having any economic success at all was to continue tourism. So what they actually tried to do is they tried to separate tourism from the rest of the country. They tried to create a wonderful, idealistic communist country that still had a tourist sector the way it was before.
Okay.
So they would set off parts of the country where Cubans couldn't go unless they were employees. And that was where they wanted all the tourists to go to spend their money. And that system didn't work because of actual market economies. People came and they were like, well, this is a wonderful beach and this is a wonderful resort, but I'm also going to go to this other city. And the Cuban government doesn't restrict travel. They want tourists to be happy and they want tourists to keep coming. And it's a very tourist-friendly country. So there are lots and lots and lots and lots of people trying to make a buck off of the tourists. And they do a really good job with the service sector. The only problem is the food.
All right. Just the infrastructure as far as food goes.
Mm-hmm.
Makes sense.
They even have air-conditioned buses connecting all of the cities. I have heard bad things about the trains and airplanes domestically, so I didn't try them.
And the highlight of, let's do Havana first.
Okay, great. The highlight of Havana is walking along the malecon, which is the famous, I think it's 10 or 15 kilometers long, paved waterfront.
Mm-hmm.
And it's full of families, musicians, locals, tourists. And on one side, you've got the ocean, 90 miles away from Florida. And on the other side, you've got all of the beautiful colonial architecture with columns and arches and windows. You have locals calling out and singing music. You have people walking dogs, families laughing, people fishing, people jumping and swimming in the water. And this is not just on Sunday, although on Sunday there's much more of it. It's every day. The Cubans really do know how to enjoy themselves, especially in that part of the city.
And then you also went to Trinidad.
Mm-hmm.
Not the island nation, but Trinidad and Cuba.
Exactly. It can be confusing. Trinidad is one of the most famous tourist destinations in Cuba. It's a 5 or 6 hour bus ride from Havana, and it's on the south side right near the coast. The reason people go there is because it's kind of a time capsule, which in a way all of Cuba is. But Trinidad is a small walking city with cobblestone streets, restricted traffic, motor vehicle traffic. Lots of people, tourists I mean, and locals, riding bicycles, children playing stickball, churches, live music every night in 4 different places. Fantastic, full of culture, a real gem. It's also, I think, a UNESCO heritage site, if I remember correctly.
Interesting. And that's on the south coast of Cuba? Or am I remember that?
Correct.
Okay.
It's on the south coast of Cuba, and it's near one of the top 10 beaches, according to some lists in Cuba. So a lot of people will combine Trinidad, which isn't actually on the coast, it's 5 kilometers from the coast, with a visit to Playa Ancon, which is what we did as well.
Okay. And the beach there is?
It's nice. It's really nice. Some people would go to Cuba for the beaches, and I didn't. So that was the only beach I went to, and it was wonderful.
Okay.
But I've been to nicer beaches, and I think there are nicer beaches in Cuba. But
Okay.
it was fantastic. It was wonderful. I stopped a little bit before the main section of the beach and stayed under a thatched roof. I had to pay $2 to rent the thatched roof.
Mm-hmm.
And I hung out on the beach for hours and just enjoyed it. I went for a snorkel, and I ate some food, drank a beer, relaxed. It was wonderful.
What warning would you give?
Money. I would have to warn you about this money situation in Cuba. When you go there, you have to change your money, and the government takes 10 to 20% immediately as a tax on all tourists changing money.
Okay.
Because of that, although the Cuban peso, the CUC, the Cuban convertible peso, is equivalent to $1, you actually only get 80 cents of it for every $1.
Okay.
So you spend $80, 80 Cuban pesos, and you're really spending $100. And also, if you're traveling as an American, you can't use your credit cards. You can't use your bank cards. You have to travel with completely all your money in cash. So that is a big warning. If you are a person with family in Cuba or family abroad, I met lots of people who have bank accounts in other countries or have connections with people inside of Cuba, and they're not in the same situation as a first-time traveler would be. But if you're going there, you have to be really careful with the expenses. You have to bring enough money in cash for everything you need to do.
Now, part of that is because you were trying to go under the radar, or is that just in general?
Well, until the embargo is lifted, the American banks can't use their credit cards. Any American bank credit card can't be used in Cuba.
Got it.
At all. And same with ATM withdrawals.
One of the reasons that I wanted to do this show, and I realize I'm going to get in trouble for it, not worried about the U.S. government, but certainly some of the listeners, but my prediction is the embargo will be lifted this year.
I hope so. As you might have heard, for the first time ever in the history of the polls of the Miami expat Cubans, the tide has shifted to 51% favoring an end to the embargo.
Right, and I think that's the main reason why we haven't lifted the embargo until now, because at this point Cuba isn't a threat to us, which clearly it was back during the Cuban Missile Crisis. There was a different situation going on there. And for one thing, they were being propped up at that point by a lot of money coming in from Russia, but that were from the Soviet Union, sorry. Yeah.
As far as I understand it, politicians did not want to end the embargo because the Cuban expats in a swing state
absolutely
did not want to end the embargo.
No, absolutely.
And according to everyone I've spoken with who understands the situation, including what I listened to on NPR recently when they did some specials on it, ending the embargo would not help the Cuban government because they use it as an excuse for why the locals can't get eggs. So if locals complain about anything, they say, well, we have to be strong and we have to put up with it. It's in the name of fighting the big power to the north, and it's because of the embargo that you don't have access to resources. So they use it to justify the situation. It empowers the Cuban government.
The best day you had?
Best day I had in Cuba would have to be reuniting with my long-lost family.
Oh, wonderful.
My mother actually went to Cuba last year, and she emboldened me to go by convincing me that it was worthwhile and that I should go now before the embargo is lifted and it becomes like the Bahamas. So, I mean, that won't happen immediately. You probably have plenty of time, but I did want to see it now. And my favorite moment in Cuba was I called up a man who I'd never met before, who I didn't even know existed until my mother told me about him. And it ends up that we share a great-great-grandmother. So that would make him something like my fifth cousin or my cousin 5 times removed or something. I can't keep track. But it was a wonderful experience meeting him and his wife and his kids. And
he would be your third cousin, by the way.
Third cousin, and then would it be 5 times removed?
No, 5 times removed would be your great-great-great-grandkids would be like 5 times removed or whatever. You have to go off by 5 generations. I could draw it for you later.
Okay. He is on my mother's leg. His children are equal to me.
Okay.
I don't know if that complicates things more or less. But there's actually a photograph of him with my mother in, I guess it would be 1956 in Tampa. he has been around for a while, and my mother had forgotten that she had met him. And then I went down there and hung out with him and his family, and it was just an incredibly moving experience to be with real family that I didn't know existed. You know, you always hear about that in TV shows.
Right.
And I actually found long-lost relatives, so it was a wonderful thing, and I got to see the country partly from a local perspective because of that.
What did you take away from that experience? How are you different for having gone and met that part of the family?
I'm different not just from having met them, but from having met three people.
Okay.
Them as a representative of your traditional Cuban family who don't have special connections and don't have wealth or access to special resources. They're wonderful, amazing people who work really, really, really hard, and they're living in a house that's not so nice, and they can't afford paint to paint their house. He is a child psychiatrist, and he's paid less than the people who clean the floors in the hospital because the system is an inverted pyramid. So he then raises pigs in his backyard to get enough money to make ends meet. And he does both things with an industrious nature, and he's a wonderful man with a great family who's doing the best he can. And he's somewhat happy. He's not unhappy.
Mm-hmm.
But what made my life different is having seen him and talked to him about his situation. And then at the same time, I met people on the flight who introduced me to people in Cuba who do have better connections. And I spent some time in a household that was in the old American embassy. So I actually was in the old American embassy with a roast pig, a whole entire roast pig on a table. And that was a party. And they had better access to resources because of political connections. And they were happy also, and they were a wonderful family, and I loved being with them. But seeing the differences and talking to people and hearing what they had to say, as well as just talking to cab drivers, it was really an enlightening experience. I really feel like I have a much better understanding of what works and doesn't work in communism, and why people would try to make it work for 50 years rather than trying to change it, and what things are more frustrating and what things are less frustrating. It's a totally different perspective than I had, for example, visiting China, where I didn't speak the language and I didn't have connections to locals.
Okay. So it sounds like one of your takeaways that in Cuba, all Cubans are equal, just some are more equal than others.
That would be definitely the case. They're also somewhat happy with the communist government.
Sure, that's my understanding.
In that they do want things to change. They want things to get better.
Mm-hmm.
But they don't necessarily want it to become capitalist.
Interesting. Okay. What do you wish you had known before you went?
I wish I had known more Spanish. I know enough Spanish to get in trouble, but not enough to get out of trouble. And I really enjoyed communicating in the local language. It was a big plus.
You're going to send me some pictures of your trip.
Indeed.
What picture just brings you back there immediately? That picture is Cuba for you.
You see, being a professional photographer, I shot over 1,000 photographs. I'm going to pick two or three.
Okay.
They all involve people, because the Cuban people are a very important part of it. And alongside them are either classic cars or colonial architecture, and in some cases both. And that just recalls back Cuba to me. I have some with these children playing games in the street. I have another one with a man talking to another man leaning against the wall of a colonial house with a car. And if I can add one more on there, it would be the malecon. Photographs I took while walking along that strip of asphalt filled with people and ocean and colonial architecture. It's fantastic.
Let's see. I think you already answered the "you really know you're in Cuba" win.
Yeah, but I'd rather re-answer it.
Okay.
I would have to say, when you're walking on the malecon, seeing families walk by, all smiles and laughter, at the same time as you're watching the waves crash against the wall, you see 1950s classic cars drive by. And then you hear some horses' hooves, and you see a horse-drawn carriage. And at the same time, in the background, Cuban music is playing.
As we go to wind this down, what's one thing people should know before they go to Cuba? And one thing they should pack before they go to Cuba?
Okay. One thing you should know when going to Cuba is where you're going to get your fix of Cuban music. It is a highlight of the country, and most people have probably heard of the Buena Vista Social Club. And that type of music can be found in all corners of the country, as can Afro-Cuban influenced music and all sorts of different stuff. And that is something that you definitely need to make time for. In Trinidad, for example, every single night, I was there for 3 nights, my brother and I went out and just watched local musicians play local music, and tourists and locals danced salsa, and everybody was full of laughter and joy.
Okay. And one thing you should pack.
If you're going to Cuba, you should definitely pack some donations. There are websites that list what the country needs, and there are organizations that will pick them up. So you can bring medical supplies, musical instruments, books, but not of a political nature. For example, we were in a part of the city, and the musicians didn't have the right strings for their guitars. They were using metal strings, electric guitar strings, on an acoustic guitar because they didn't have access to the right kinds of strings. It is a bit sad, and if you're going and you can, decide on what part of the system you would like to improve through donations, and go to a website and find out what the country needs and do your best to pack something that you're going to give away.
Okay. You spent a lot of time with locals. What's one place that you went you wouldn't have known about unless you'd run into these people that you're so glad you went to?
The people's houses.
Okay.
That's the only thing I can say. But I'll tell you a little short story about my brother's favorite moment in Cuba, which is even better than mine.
Sure, as long as we've gotten him in trouble already, we might as well mention him.
Yes, indeed. So the most memorable moment for my brother in Cuba was one day when he and I separated, and I did my own thing, walking around photographing. He went off for a 14-kilometer walk, and he ended up in the middle of nowhere, alone, sweaty and tired, and he looks pretty Cuban. So some people come by in a horse-drawn carriage, and they tell him to get on. And he gets on, and about 5 minutes later, they find out he's not Cuban. They have a laugh about it and pat him on the back. He speaks enough Spanish to barely understand them, and they ask him if it's okay if they take him with them for an errand. And he says he'd love to. So they're giving him a ride back to town because he's tired of walking, and they stop at a sugarcane field. So they give him a machete, and there are video clips and photographs of my brother hacking down sugarcane with a machete with locals, helping them out on a little errand to earn some extra cash or help out a family that needs more sugar.
Funny. To close this up, if you had to summarize Cuba in 3 words, what 3 words would you use?
Tranquilo, or tranquil, for sure. Traditional. It is a lot of traditional culture and people. And I feel bad saying this. I don't want to denigrate the country, but sad. There is something sad, not about the people, just about the fact that there are so many buildings that are in disrepair. And I know the situation could be a lot better without too much of a sacrifice or too much of a change. And I feel partly responsible for it because of the political problems for the past 60 years or 50 years.
Okay. Sam, thanks so much for coming on the show and talking to us about your trip to Cuba. I hope you don't get into too much trouble for it.
Thank you very much, Chris. I'm pretty sure that within, about 6 days, it should be fine.
Thanks so much.
Take care.
I should note, for those of you who have been looking at the iTunes Enhanced version, all the pictures in there that were not attributed elsewhere are all pictures that Sam took. I have one internet resource for you today, and since we were talking about Cuba and studying Spanish, that is studyspanish.com, and studyspanish.com has a number of different audio as well as visual lessons that will help you learn Spanish, and they are for free, so check that out, studyspanish.com. In news of the community, I still have that contest to tell me about your favorite city and to win a book about Mexico City. I have only one entry and I have 4 books, so help me out, write me a blog post about your favorite city. I had some great comments recently at amateurtraveler.com. One was from Mark, and Mark said, "Dear Chris, I wanted to thank you for all the effort and time you have invested in the Amateur Traveler podcast." Actually, I think Mark said the American Traveler podcast. "I have been a casual listener for a few months and have completely enjoyed all the programs that I have listened to. The most recent one that I listened to was episode 167, Travel to Israel. I have visited Israel about 12 times in the past few years, but unfortunately all of my visits have been for business, and my time in country has always been packed with meetings. In listening to Doug's description of the Israel, it appears that I completely missed the country. I have seen none of the sights or vistas that he mentioned, even though I have been very close to several of the areas that he mentioned. As a result of listening to this latest podcast, I have started the process of planning a trip with my family, 2 adults and 2 children, 18 and 15, for next year, 2010. I hate to admit this, but my work for my previous employer required that I travel as part of my business development activities. However, all my trips were spent in airports and conference rooms. As a result, I visited many countries, but I've seen very few. Mark, I'm glad you have plans to join the ranks of those of us who are amateur travelers, that is, who travel for the love of it, rather than just business travelers." I had a number of positive comments about that particular show. Daniel also wrote and said, "I always enjoy listening to your podcast when I'm on road trips or traveling long distances. In my car, I had an opportunity as I was heading back home to Houston from a day trip to San Antonio, and I listened to the Israel podcast. Kudos to Doug. He was a fantastic guest." He was a fantastic guest. As I said, we're going to have him back on again. Really described the trip, which got me excited about possibly going. Israel was never in my top 10, but has quickly become so after listening. Nice job, Chris. And of course, a lot of that thanks goes to Doug. With that, we'll bring this episode of the Amateur Traveler to a close. Remember the travel contest. Feel free to post comments at amateurtraveler.com, as both Daniel and Mark did, or drop me an email at host@amateurtraveler.com. And as always, thanks so much for listening.